Timescape. Picard and friends have to solve a temporal mystery.
Beverly is fixing Riker's face after he got hurt trying to feed Data's cat Spot while Data is gone.
Beverly says she would love to feed Spot, and Riker tosses her the handheld weapon of mass destruction as a joke, saying she'll need it.
Riker is called to the bridge for a distress call that turns out to be of Romulan origin. And it's good to see that their response to a distress call is to just wait for Riker to casually stroll onto the bridge to ask about it.
They suspect a trap, since they're dirty Romulans, and Picard won't be back for another 13 hours, but they head cautiously in that direction.
Picard, Troy, Data, and Geordi are on a shuttle heading back to the Enterprise after a conference.
And since this episode involves Romulans and now a conference, I assume that at least 2 of the 4 had at some point been abducted and brainwashed.
Troy tells a story about being hit on by a creepy expert on interspecies mating, then talks about how boring the rest of it was.
And Picard says he went to a presentation, and the dude talked for an hour about the wrong subject. And it was cool to hear them talking like real people. We don't get that often.
Geordi talks about how he got a chance to touch a plasma field, which I'm sure was not a dangerous thing to do at all. He's probably some kind of energy being at this point. And Data keeps misinterpreting Troy's reactions to things to hilarious results.
I can tell by your tone, you don't actually think that. Geordi freezes in mid-sentence, and Troy discovers that she's the only one who isn't frozen.
And when they go back to normal, none of them seem to realize anything has happened.
Geordi scans everybody, says he can't find anything wrong, and Data says both his and the ship's computer are also exactly lined up, so it can't be a time discrepancy, even though later it will turn out to be a time discrepancy.
Picard walks Troy through things again, and she says she didn't sense anything unusual from any of them.
And I noticed that she did that technique she told Barclay about in Realm of Fear, which was a cool little reference that I almost missed.
She says she might just have been tired, which was a stupid thing for her to say. She suddenly finds everyone right next to her, and they tell her that she was motionless for over 3 minutes.
Geordi says that her scan from before and scan from now showed that she should have aged 3 minutes more than she actually did.
It's amazing that a handheld tricorder can give them so much information, but they still miss important things all the time. Data tells Picard that the Enterprise is not responding to their hails. They speed up, but experience failure in one of the engines.
And it results in a really goofy tilt. Geordi says part of the fuel has been completely drained, and Data says the ship says it's been in operation for 47 days.
And that's when I said, okay, it's not a Troy episode, it's an episode where random stuff happens for a long time until they find out why.
Which sounds like a time discrepancy. So that's when I suspected that Data was really a Romulan spy.
Picard goes to grab some tasty decaying fruit and suddenly recoils in pain.
I thought it was really dumb that he noticed that bowl and how rotten everything was and then went to touch it.
Troy tells him that the cells in his hand have aged quickly.
Data finds that time is moving way faster inside of a sphere encompassing part of the ship.
Picard tells Geordi to see if he can move them away from it, even though they've been moving through space the whole time and one of the engines is now out of fuel. But it still seems to work.
Until they find that there are these disturbances all over the place, and they seem to be emanating from the direction of the Enterprise.
Data says that time is moving at a different rate in each one of the disturbance areas. Picard tells them to maneuver their way through, which reminded me of Booby Trap.
They eventually find the Enterprise, because it's not where it's supposed to be, and it is frozen and in the middle of a battle with a Romulan ship.
Geordi wonders if the Enterprise had time to get off a shot, right before they discuss a clearly visible energy beam coming from the Enterprise to the Romulan ship, which turns out not to be a weapon, but they don't know that at the time.
Picard says they need to get over there without being frozen. Geordi and Data say they can use the armbands from Time Zero, and they use a bunch of technobabble to explain how it's going to work.
Geordi says that if they want to interact with anything, the field around them would have to be practically skin-tight. And he says he thinks it's going to work, which was absurd, even for this show.
And he will stay behind to monitor them.
And they kind of make a joke about how long things always take on this show when Geordi says it'll take a while.
It would seem that time is something that we have plenty of.
Even though everybody could be dead, for all they know. Once they beam aboard, Picard discovers they can still move stuff, which to me didn't really make much sense, but they had to do that for the plot.
They find 3 Romulans on the bridge, seemingly attacking Riker and the others. Data mentions that the computer equipment is not functioning, But somehow, he and Picard are able to hit buttons that still beep, and Picard pulls up information.
Equipment is no longer functioning. However, the information currently
Data detects a power surge in engineering, and Picard and Troy go to sickbay and one of the transporter rooms.
Because that's where they find that security had been sent.
They're also still able to communicate with Geordi from inside the time bubble thing, which was interesting.
Yeah, they mentioned how they did that at some point.
Oh, well, they mentioned a lot of things that I kind of rolled my eyes at.
Yeah.
And they have to head to those areas on foot because Geordi says he doesn't want to beam them, since it uses so much energy.
They take some Jeffries tubes and go down some ladders, but they find their route blocked by frozen people.
But since they can move things, why don't they just move them out of the way?
I mean, yeah, how does gravity work if they're frozen in time?
Good question.
They end up going a different way and separate, and Troy walks past a bunch of frozen people before finding Beverly being zapped by a Romulan.
And as she runs out to tell Picard, one of the frozen Romulans wakes up.
Which reminded me of the phased Romulan in the next phase.
This Romulan is played by Patricia Tallman, who I recognized as Barbara from the 1990 Night of the Living Dead and the Witch from Army of Darkness.
I like how you say you recognize her, even though you can't see her face, but yeah.
I look past the surface. You would be well advised to not be so superficial.
Uh-huh. Troy goes to Picard in the transporter room, where other Romulans had just been beamed in, who Picard notes are unarmed.
Troy tells him about Beverly, and then they both get called to engineering by Data,
who shows them that there is a warp core breach in progress. And he tells them that they were wrong about time being frozen and the explosion is expanding.
Because time is moving forward really slowly, and they only have about 9 hours before the explosion engulfs the ship.
He also tells them that there was a power transfer in progress, which is the beam that they saw going from the Enterprise to the Romulan ship.
Suddenly, Picard starts laughing, because he's made a smiley face in the explosion, which means he touched it without burning himself or whatever. I hope that was safe.
Yeah. He acts like a maniac for a while before collapsing, and then starts acting even crazier.
So Geordi beams them all back over.
He says that Picard wasn't completely protected from the temporal difference, or whatever.
But doesn't take responsibility, even though he was the one who set all of that up.
And Data gives a really goofy explanation.
In much the same way deep-sea divers experience nitrogen narcosis, you experienced a form of temporal narcosis.
Picard says they need to get over to the Romulan ship to figure out what was going on with the power transfer, but since he's wigging out, he's the one who stays behind this time.
And he mentions Troy's experience on a Romulan vessel in face of the enemy, which I thought was cool. When they beam over, Data notes that the Romulans were not in battle mode, but were evacuating.
And Geordi discovers the Romulans were trying to shut down the power transfer from the Enterprise.
Because there was some kind of energy feedback, and that's what caused the warp core to breach.
Data says the Romulan engine is completely shut down, which Troy says is impossible, because the way their engines work prevent it from ever being turned off once it's turned on, which seemed impractical and potentially dangerous. So Geordi opens the door to the engine core, which is basically just a screen door on non-spring hinges, which also seemed impractical and potentially dangerous.
And they find what Data calls a highly focused aperture in the space-time continuum, with spots floating around it that may be organic. The aperture suddenly flashes and time goes back to normal.
So the Romulans are all evacuating, but one of them notices the away team, and there was a cool camera shot in there.
And I wondered why only one of them noticed them.
That's in my wrap-up.
Okay, I'm not allowed to make that point then. Okay.
No.
From the shuttle, Picard sees the Enterprise explode, then time goes back, including on the Romulan ship, and things end up where they were before.
Data says the whole thing was caused by him scanning the engine core. Geordi says when time was moving, the Romulans were trying to stop whatever was happening, and when he goes to check it out, he notices a suspecting Romulan from before is in a different position.
The Romulan grabs him, and they both go into neural shock.
Troy removes Geordi's armband so he doesn't die, and Data says the Romulan isn't actually a Romulan.
They take the supposed Romulan onto the other ship, and Data says he may not be from their time continuum.
So I guess it's okay that they're moving him into their shuttle time continuum?
Who the hell knows? Data analyzes the organic matter in the temporal aperture, and they throw out a bunch of nonsensical jargon that brings them to the conclusion that they were some kind of embryos.
The not Romulan wakes up and reveals that their young were in danger and trapped in the engine core.
He says their young are incubated in gravity wells, which I'm sure was an idea the writers thought was super clever, even though it doesn't really make sense.
And since the engine core is an artificial gravity well, they thought it would work, but it did not. It caused the Romulan engine to shut down, and the Enterprise tried to recharge it with a power transfer, but since that transfer threatened the embryos, the adults imitated Romulans and attacked the Enterprise to stop it.
He says there is one other not Romulan, but he disappears from time or something before they can figure out where it is.
Picard says that when Data scanned the core, it caused time to move forwards, then backwards, so just do the opposite and get time back to period before the core breach. And Data says, sure, I'll just reroute the flim-flam postulator to reprogram the auxiliary transmitters to generate a compressed time matrix. Like he even had to say that. What, do you think we're stupid or something?
Data modifies the tricorder and sets it to operate on its own on the Romulan ship.
And the three of them are in position on the Enterprise to fix things as soon as time starts moving.
When time flows backward, the other not Romulan grabs Data and they both get shocked, but Data recovers as time begins flowing forward again.
But he's still too late to stop the power transfer and can't turn it off for some reason.
And the crewman there doesn't react at all to Data and the not Romulan suddenly appearing on the floor. Data tells the computer to place a containment field around the warp core, which apparently is something it's already set up to do. So why wouldn't they always have that in place?
Good question. In sickbay, Troy saves Beverly, and the Romulan reveals he wasn't firing at Beverly, but at the not Romulan, but Beverly got in the way. And I was really interested to see how that was possible, since Beverly was up against a wall, about 3 feet away from this guy. His explanation was flimsy at best. And that dude is played by John DeMita, I think that's how you say his name, who has done a ton of voiceover work over the years, which is pretty cool.
Data tells Picard the core breach is still going to happen, so Picard remotely flies the shuttle into the beam, which causes it to explode and everything to go back to normal.
It also causes the not Romulan and the entire Romulan ship to phase out. And they seem to ignore that any Romulans left on that ship were also tortuously phased into a different time continuum and probably suffered beyond anything the crew can imagine.
It's only what they deserve for being born Romulans. The Enterprise heads for the neutral zone to drop off the Romulans that were on their ship.
The ones that aren't being torn apart by the space-time continuum.
Riker visits Data, and there's a really dumb joke about Data trying to figure out how people perceive time by testing how long it takes a watched kettle to boil.
Riker tells him he should turn off his internal clock, which he does, and it results in the water boiling when Data isn't looking. Timescape. Overall,
Yet another episode based around a shaky sci-fi premise, but this one wasn't as bad as some others, ironically because they didn't try to explain it too much. Instead of giving answers to questions that didn't make any sense, they just left the questions all alone, and somehow that was better. There were a lot of questions around how any of this was supposed to work, and most of them don't have answers in reality, and again, that's what this entire episode was about. There were a lot of things that bothered me about the way people reacted to things or didn't react to things. I thought it was cool that the Romulans didn't turn out to be the bad guys, but that's pretty much the only good thing I can say about this episode. Saying that it could have been worse is not exactly high praise. It was an interesting idea, and I feel like if they had writers that understood the idea, it could have turned out good. It felt like a pretty standard handling of this kind of idea, which means it wasn't great. I did like the way they referenced previous episodes a few times, but honestly that probably brought up more questions than anything else. I gave this episode a D+.
I gave it a C-. This was a cool idea and a mystery that at first was actually a mystery, and it kept me engaged up until they started to solve it. The stuff on the shuttle was cool, but once they actually went over to the Enterprise, things started to fall apart. With the, I guess we can move stuff. I wanted to know if Worf had experienced any ill effects from having his arm suddenly a foot to the right after Picard moved it to see that panel. Why did they have to go back to right when the shit hit the fan? Why not go back an hour before that? And when time started moving, it seems like people couldn't see them outside of the not Romulans. But then it was revealed that everyone could see them, but just chose not to because the script said they weren't supposed to. And the Romulan engine is powered by a black hole? How does that even work?
I wondered with the temporal disturbances, the way parts of the ship were being affected by it and parts weren't, if time was still flowing at a normal rate outside the disturbance, wouldn't that part of the ship keep flying through space? You know, half the ship should go flying off in a different direction.
Is Picard's one hand going to be way older than the rest of him for the rest of his life? That's weird.
I didn't even think about that. If this episode was well written, it would have explored ideas like that, because that's what would have been really interesting.
And they can phase in and out of time at will. Man, between this stuff and the transporters, there is no reason they should ever have any problems about anything. The Q Continuum's all worried about humans becoming more powerful. They're already more powerful than the Q. They can alter the laws of physics and time itself, but they still can't figure out how to feed a f***ing cat. Speaking of that, I wanted to see Beverly feed Spot. Would she have been attacked as well? And how would she react to another qualified medical professional effectively treating her? I would have graded this one higher if it hadn't crumbled once they started to solve things. They had to throw in way too many somehows and maybes that just happened to work out every time just to reach the finish line. This one could have been so cool, but it wasn't, which was a bummer.